Small suburban town of Oakwood Hills was quiet and peaceful, known for its friendly neighbors and well-kept lawns. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other and nothing much ever happened. But behind the doors of one modest, white picket-fenced home lived an 85-year-old widow, Margaret Whitfield, whose quiet life was about to take a dangerous turn. Margaret had spent most of her life in this house. Her husband, George, had passed away 15 years earlier, leaving her with only memories of a long and happy marriage. Her children lived out of state and rarely visited. Most days, Margaret spent her time tending to her garden, watching old movies, and browsing the internet, a hobby she picked up in her later years to feel connected to the world. It was during one of these late-night internet browsing sessions that she first met David. David introduced himself as a 52-year-old entrepreneur from Atlanta. He was tall, charming, and attentive, or so he said in his messages. His profile picture showed a handsome man with a warm smile and kind eyes. They began chatting regularly, and over weeks their conversations grew deeper. David seemed genuinely interested in Margaret's life, listening to her stories about George, her children, and her struggles with loneliness. "You're amazing, Margaret," David wrote one evening. "You deserve to be treated like a queen." For Margaret, his words were like a light in the darkness. She had never imagined someone would take such an interest in her life again. But soon the relationship took a turn. After several months of building trust, David told Margaret about his business troubles. He claimed to own a construction company, but said his funds were tied up in a big project. He needed a loan to keep his business afloat. "I hate to ask you this," he wrote, "but I don't know who else to turn to." Margaret hesitated. She wasn't wealthy, but she had savings. Money George had worked hard to leave behind for her. She told herself it wasn't much compared to helping someone she cared about. The first transfer was $5,000. One payment turned into several. Each time David had a new excuse: equipment problems, a payroll delay, legal fees. He promised to pay her back as soon as his project was completed. But months passed and Margaret began to notice cracks in David's stories. When she asked for proof of his business troubles, he sent vague emails with attached documents that looked fake. His video calls always had technical issues, and he avoided meeting in person, claiming he was too busy or too far away. Margaret's bank account began to dwindle, but David's requests only grew more urgent. The final straw came when Margaret's youngest daughter, Susan, visited her for the weekend. Susan noticed Margaret's stress and asked what was going on. Reluctantly, Margaret told her about David. Susan's reaction was immediate. "Mom, this man is scamming you," she exclaimed. Margaret refused to believe it. "He loves me, Susan. He's just in a tough spot." "Have you ever met him in person? Do you even know if he's real?" Margaret didn't answer. The truth gnawed at her. That night after Susan left, she logged into her bank account and saw the total amount she had sent David. $88,000. Her life savings were nearly gone. Something inside Margaret snapped. Humiliation turned to anger, and anger turned to determination. She was going to find David. If he wouldn't come to her, she would go to him. Using the little information she had, Margaret began to piece together clues. She searched through old emails, messages, and any details David had shared. He had mentioned Atlanta several times, and his supposed construction company had a name she vaguely remembered. Margaret didn't tell anyone about her plan. Early one morning, she packed a small suitcase, withdrew the last of her cash, and boarded a bus to Atlanta. The city was overwhelming for someone like Margaret, who hadn't traveled much since her youth. She booked a room at a cheap motel and spent her days searching for David. She visited the address he had once mentioned, only to find an abandoned lot. She called the phone number he used, but it went straight to voicemail. Still, Margaret didn't give up. She spent hours in libraries and internet cafes, searching for any trace of the man who had stolen her money and shattered her trust. Her determination led her to a lead, a social media profile linked to a man who matched David's description. But the name was different, and the profile was private. One evening, as Margaret sat in a coffee shop near the address listed on the profile, she saw him. David, or rather, the man she thought was David, walked in with another woman. He looked younger than she imagined, and he was laughing as if he hadn't a care in the world. Margaret's heart raced. She waited until he left, then followed him from a distance. He entered a large house in an upscale neighborhood. This was her chance. Margaret returned to her motel and made a plan. She would confront him the next day. She didn't know what she hoped to achieve, an apology, her money back, or maybe just closure. But she knew she couldn't leave without facing him. What Margaret didn't know was that this confrontation would set off a chain of events leading to a murder, a tangled investigation, and a shocking truth that no one could have predicted. Margaret Whitfield woke up with her heart pounding. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind. She had seen him, the man she knew as David, her online lover, and the person who had stolen her life savings. It had been months since she began to suspect she had been scammed, and now she was face to face with the man responsible. The air in her motel room was heavy with tension as she got dressed, her hands trembling. She had no plan, no backup, and no one to help her. All she had was a fire burning inside her and a desperate need for justice. The next morning, Margaret returned to the upscale neighborhood where she had followed David the previous night. His house, a large brick home with a manicured lawn, stood out among the others. She sat on a bench nearby, pretending to read a newspaper while keeping an eye on the front door. Hours passed before she saw him step outside, dressed casually in jeans and a button-down shirt. He was carrying a briefcase, looking every bit like the successful businessman he claimed to be. Margaret clenched her fists. She followed him at a safe distance as he walked down the street and entered a small coffee shop. Summoning every ounce of courage she had, Margaret stepped inside after him. David was seated at a corner table, sipping coffee and scrolling through his phone. Margaret approached slowly, her legs feeling like jelly. When she was just a few feet away, he looked up, his expression shifting from confusion to recognition, and then to something darker. "Margaret," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of unease. "What are you doing here?" "You know exactly why I'm here," Margaret replied, her voice shaking with anger. "You stole my money, my life savings. Do you think you can just get away with it?" David's eyes darted around the room, checking if anyone was watching. "Keep your voice down," he hissed. "This isn't the place to talk about this." "No," Margaret said firmly, her voice rising. "You're going to explain yourself. Right here, right now." David leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Look, you're upset and I understand that. But this isn't the whole story. Let's go somewhere private and talk." Against her better judgment, Margaret agreed to meet him later that evening at a nearby park. She spent the rest of the day pacing her motel room, torn between fear and determination. Part of her wanted to call the police, but she worried they wouldn't believe her, or worse, that David would slip away before they could act. When evening came, Margaret arrived at the park, clutching a small pepper spray canister in her pocket. David was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a flickering streetlight. "I'm here," she said, keeping her distance. David gestured for her to sit beside him, but she refused. "Start talking," she demanded. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I'm sorry for what happened. I really am. But it's not as simple as you think. I was in a tough spot and I needed the money." "I didn't mean to hurt you." Margaret's anger flared. "You didn't mean to hurt me? You lied to me, used me, and left me with nothing. Do you even have a business? Or was that all a lie too?" David hesitated, and for a moment Margaret thought she saw a flicker of guilt in his eyes. "The business is real," he said quietly, "but it's struggling. I got in over my head." "That's no excuse," Margaret snapped. "You destroyed my life and now you're just going to walk away?" David stood up, his demeanor shifting. "What do you want from me, Margaret? The money's gone. I can't give it back. I don't have it." Margaret's hand tightened around the pepper spray. "You think you can just say sorry and make it all go away? You think I'll let you get away with this?" David took a step closer, his voice low and menacing. "You don't know who you're messing with, Margaret. Walk away while you still can." Before Margaret could respond, the situation escalated. Another man appeared from the shadows, a tall, muscular figure with a stern expression. He walked straight up to David and grabbed him by the collar. "You've been running your mouth too much, David," the man said coldly. "Time to settle your debts." Margaret froze, her mind racing. Who was this man? Was he another victim? Or something worse? David struggled against the man's grip, his bravado crumbling. "I can get the money," he stammered. "Just give me more time." The man sneered. "Time's up." Margaret watched in horror as the man dragged David away, disappearing into the darkness. She wanted to follow, but fear rooted her to the spot. Shaking, Margaret returned to her motel and called the police. She told them everything about David, the scam, and the mysterious man who had taken him. The dispatcher assured her that officers would investigate, but Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she had just stepped into something far bigger than she realized. As she hung up the phone, a knock sounded at her door. Her heart leapt into her throat. Margaret's pulse quickened when she saw the man standing outside her motel room door. She stepped back from the peephole, unsure of what to do. Her mind raced. Had she become part of something far more dangerous than she realized? She had only intended to confront David, but now it seemed like there were forces at play beyond her control. For a moment, she debated whether to call the police again, but before she could decide, the knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. Margaret felt a surge of panic but forced herself to stay calm. She had no choice but to face him. Slowly, she opened the door, her hand still gripping the pepper spray in her pocket. The man stood there, his broad shoulders blocking the hallway. His eyes were cold and calculating, and he seemed to tower over her despite her years. "You're Margaret Whitfield, right?" he asked, his voice smooth and menacing. Margaret nodded, her throat tight. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "My name's Frank. I think we need to have a little talk." Margaret's heart raced, and for a moment, she considered slamming the door shut, but she was too slow. Frank's hand shot out and stopped the door from closing, pushing it back open with surprising force. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be," he said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. Margaret instinctively took a step back, her eyes darting around the room for a way out. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. Frank didn't immediately answer. Instead, he closed the door behind him and leaned against it, crossing his arms over his chest. He sized her up for a moment, taking in her frail figure and the look of confusion in her eyes. "You've been asking a lot of questions about David," he said finally, his tone laced with a hint of amusement. "I'm guessing you've figured out that he's not exactly who he claims to be." Margaret's stomach churned. "I've figured out enough," she snapped. "He's a liar and a thief. And you're a part of his mess." Frank chuckled, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "You're smarter than I thought, but you don't know the whole story. David's in deeper than you realize. And now, you've made yourself a problem for me." Margaret took a cautious step back. "I don't care about your problems. I care about getting my money back. I want what's mine." Frank's smile faded, replaced by a hard, unreadable expression. "That's not how this works, sweetheart. David is just a small part of a much bigger operation. You've been chasing him for a reason. He was supposed to take you out of the picture without a fuss, but now you've stirred things up." Margaret's blood ran cold. "What do you mean? What operation?" Frank stepped forward, lowering his voice. "David was supposed to get you to invest in a fake business. The money you gave him, it wasn't just for him. You're one of many who've fallen for the same scam. But the real game? Well, that's just getting started." Margaret's head spun. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had thought it was all about David, his lies, his charm, his manipulations. But now it seemed there was a much bigger conspiracy at play. "You've been used," Frank continued, his voice darkening. "And if you're smart, you'll stop asking questions. You'll forget about David and the money and go back to your quiet life." Margaret shook her head, refusing to back down. I won't let him get away with it. I'm not scared of you." Frank's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, his calm demeanor faltered. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small black device. "You should be." Margaret froze as the device beeped, its purpose still unclear. Frank watched her closely, then pocketed the device, his expression unreadable. "You're not just up against David," he said quietly. "You're in over your head, Margaret. And if you keep pushing, there's no guarantee you'll make it out alive." Margaret's heart raced, but she forced herself to stand tall. "You're threatening me? I've lost everything because of David, and now you're trying to scare me into submission?" Frank didn't answer at first. Instead, he stepped closer to her, his breath warm on her face. "You've got one chance, Margaret. Walk away from this. Leave the past behind and never look back. Forget you ever knew David, and I'll make sure nothing happens to you." Margaret's mind raced. She thought of her children, her family, and how much she had already lost. She couldn't just walk away. Not now. Not after everything. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm going to make sure David pays for what he's done. And I don't care what you or anyone else throws at me." Frank's face darkened, and for a brief moment, Margaret saw something in his eyes, a flicker of something dangerous. Then, just as quickly, his expression softened, and he stepped back. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "But don't say I didn't warn you." He reached for the door handle and opened it, stepping back out into the hallway. Margaret didn't move. She stood frozen for a long time, her heart pounding in her chest. Her legs felt weak, but she refused to show any sign of fear. As Frank disappeared down the hallway, Margaret locked the door behind him and leaned against it, breathing heavily. The weight of the situation pressed down on her. She had no idea what kind of trouble she was in, but one thing was clear. This was no longer just about getting her money back. It was about survival. Margaret knew she had to act fast. If Frank and David were part of something much bigger than just a simple scam, the stakes were higher than ever. She couldn't let herself be intimidated into backing down. The first step, she decided, was to gather more information. She needed to know everything she could about David and his connections. She couldn't rely on the police alone. She had to take matters into her own hands. But Margaret wasn't the same woman she had been when she first met David online. She was older, wiser, and ready to fight for what she had left. Her next move was clear. She needed to track down David, find out who he was working with, and most importantly, get the answers she was owed. Even if it meant going deeper into the danger she had only just begun to understand. The next day, Margaret woke early, a sense of urgency thrumming through her veins. After last night's confrontation with Frank, she knew there was no turning back. She had been pushed into a corner, and there was no way out but forward. The realization that her life, her savings, and even her future were all hanging by a thread had ignited something in her. She was no longer the naive woman who had been taken advantage of. She was determined to find David and make him pay for what he had done, not just to her, but to all the other women he had scammed. Margaret knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed someone who understood how to navigate the shadows of the internet, someone who could trace the steps of a man like David. She reached for her phone, hesitating for just a moment. The decision to call her grandson, Luke, wasn't easy. He was a bright young man, always interested in technology, but Margaret had kept her troubles hidden from him for so long. He didn't know about the money she'd lost or the secret world she had been drawn into through her online romance. Still, in her desperation, she swallowed her pride. "Hello?" Luke answered, his voice groggy but warm. "Luke, it's Grandma," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I need your help. It's about David. I need you to trace someone for me. I think he's dangerous." There was a brief pause on the other end, then Luke's voice, more alert now. "Grandma, what do you mean? What's going on? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, but I'm in some trouble. I think I've been scammed. David, the man I've been talking to online, he's not who he says he is. I need you to help me find him." There was another long pause, this time more serious. Luke's voice lowered. "Grandma, what are you talking about? What kind of scam? Are you sure?" "I know what I'm saying," she replied firmly. "He's taken everything, Luke, all my savings. I need to track him down before it's too late." Luke didn't ask any more questions, though Margaret could hear the concern in his voice. "Okay, I'll help you. Just tell me everything you know about him." Margaret took a deep breath and started to recount the details of her interactions with David. She told him about the first message, the charm he exuded, the lies he had told about his job, and the promises he made about a future together. She explained how it had all spiraled out of control, how she had become so emotionally invested that when he asked for money, she didn't question it. She trusted him, and now everything had crumbled. Luke listened patiently, taking notes, and asked her to send him any messages or photos she had saved from David. Margaret dug through her bag, pulling out the crumpled papers with David's contact details, the letters he had written her, and the few photographs he had shared. She snapped photos of everything and sent them to Luke. "I'll get to work on this," Luke said after reviewing the materials. "I'll try to track him down. But Grandma, you need to be careful. If he's involved in anything illegal, it could be dangerous." "I understand," Margaret replied, though her resolve hadn't wavered. "But I'm not backing down. I need to find him." The conversation ended with Luke promising to keep her updated, and Margaret sat back in her chair, her mind racing. She had to wait now, but her instincts told her it wouldn't be long before she heard from him. The day dragged on, each hour ticking by with excruciating slowness. Margaret didn't sit idly, though. She spent the time researching everything she could about scams, frauds, and con artists. The more she learned, the more she realized how deep and complex the world David had drawn her into was. She hadn't just been scammed for her money. She had been entangled in a much larger operation, one that involved more than just stolen funds. It was a web of lies, manipulation, and deception that extended far beyond her. By late afternoon, Margaret's phone rang. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw Luke's name on the screen. "Grandma," Luke said, his voice tense, "I've found something. It's not good." Margaret's stomach sank. "What do you mean?" "I found a name associated with David. It's not just him. He's working with someone else. Someone much more dangerous. And there's a trail of victims. Other people who have been scammed just like you. But the thing is, some of them are missing." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "Missing? What do you mean? Are you saying David could be involved in something worse?" "I'm afraid so," Luke replied. "I've traced some of the transactions, and they lead back to a group. They're known for running these types of cons, big scams involving fake relationships. And, based on what I've found, it looks like they use the victims for more than just money. I think David's just a pawn in something much bigger." Margaret was silent for a moment, trying to process the information. The world she had thought she knew, the online romance, the promises of a better future, was falling apart before her eyes. "Luke, I need you to help me find him. I need to confront him. I can't let this go." "Grandma," Luke's voice was filled with concern, "I don't think this is something you can handle on your own. These people are dangerous. You need to get out of this before—" "I'm not running anymore, Luke," Margaret interrupted, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and determination. "I've already lost everything. I'm not going to let them win." There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, Luke sighed. "I'll help you, Grandma, but you need to promise me that you'll be careful. Promise me you won't do anything reckless." "I promise," Margaret said, though she knew deep down that she couldn't promise anything. Her heart was set on one thing: finding David, confronting him, and taking back what was rightfully hers. The danger didn't matter. She couldn't let him escape. "Okay," Luke said. "I'll keep digging, but you need to lay low. Don't trust anyone until we figure this out." "I will," Margaret replied, though she wasn't sure how much longer she could remain in hiding. She had a feeling that time was running out. That night, as Margaret lay awake in her motel bed, the weight of everything finally settled on her. David, the man she had trusted, the man she had fallen in love with, was not who he claimed to be. He was a part of something far darker than she had ever imagined, and as the hours passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She wasn't alone in this anymore. But Margaret realized that she had no idea just how far the rabbit hole went. What had started as an online romance had turned into a nightmare, and soon she would have to confront the man who had destroyed her life. Margaret's nerves were frayed by the time morning arrived. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of David and the trail she had been following. The hours ticked by, and she could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her chest. Luke had warned her to lay low, but she had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to wait any longer. The last few weeks of her life had been consumed by fear, regret, and unanswered questions. And now the only thing that mattered was confronting David. She packed her things quickly, her hands shaking as she shoved clothes into her suitcase. She couldn't stay in the motel anymore. She felt exposed, as if she were a sitting target. Every time the door creaked or a car drove by, Margaret's heart would race. She couldn't ignore the feeling that someone was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. By noon, Margaret was on the road again. She didn't know where she was going, but Luke had given her an address. It was a lead he had uncovered during his investigation. The address was associated with a name, someone connected to David. The man's name was Gregor Ivanov, and according to Luke, he had been linked to several other fraud schemes across the country. Margaret had no idea who Gregor was, but she was willing to take any chance that came her way. If she could find him, maybe she could find David. The drive was long and exhausting. Margaret tried to focus on the road, but her mind kept drifting back to David. She thought about the lies he had told her, the promises he had made, and the way he had made her feel. Special, loved, needed. In retrospect, it felt like a cruel joke, but at the time she had believed him. How could she have been so foolish? She was an experienced woman, but when it came to love, she had been blind. Now she was paying the price for her naivety. As she neared the address Luke had given her, Margaret began to feel a sense of unease settle over her. The area was isolated, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. The houses were few and spread apart, and the trees that lined the street gave the place an eerie, almost haunting atmosphere. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood Margaret would have expected to find someone like Gregor Ivanov. The more she thought about it, the more she wondered if this was a trap. But there was no turning back now. Margaret parked her car at the end of the street and checked the address again. The house she was looking for was on the right, tucked behind a thicket of trees. It was an older house with peeling paint and an overgrown yard. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of movement. For a moment, Margaret hesitated. Her gut told her that something was wrong, but she couldn't stop now. She had to go inside. She gathered her courage and approached the front door, knocking firmly 3 times. The sound echoed in the silence, and Margaret felt her pulse quicken. No answer. She knocked again, this time louder. Still nothing. She stepped back, scanning the yard for any signs of life. The place was eerily still. That's when she noticed a faint noise coming from the side of the house. It was a soft thumping sound, almost like someone was moving furniture. Or maybe something else. Margaret's instincts kicked in. She couldn't explain why, but she knew she wasn't alone. Without thinking, she moved toward the side of the house, her heart pounding in her chest. She crouched down low, peering around the corner. And there he was, David. But he wasn't alone. Standing next to David was a tall man with broad shoulders and a cold, menacing look in his eyes. Gregor Ivanov. The moment Margaret saw him, her stomach dropped. This wasn't just a con. This was a dangerous world she had stumbled into. David and Gregor were talking in low voices, too absorbed in their conversation to notice Margaret. She stepped back quietly, her mind racing. She had to get out of there. But before she could make a move, David turned and looked directly at her. Her heart skipped a beat. "Margaret," David said, his voice flat, "I thought you might show up." The shock of being caught off guard was quickly replaced by a cold, unrelenting fury. Margaret straightened up, facing David and Gregor with a determination she hadn't felt before. You lied to me. You took everything from me, and now you're going to pay." David smiled, but there was no warmth in it. His eyes were cold, calculating. "You think you can just walk in here and threaten me? You've been warned, Margaret. This was never going to end well for you." Gregor stepped forward, his hand reaching for something in his jacket. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as he pulled out a gun, its metallic gleam catching the light. "You should have stayed away," Gregor growled. "This isn't your fight." Margaret's mind raced, trying to process the situation. She could feel her heart beating in her chest, but she refused to back down. She had already lost everything. Her money, her dignity, and now it seemed her very life was on the line. But she wasn't going to let them win. David's voice was eerily calm. "You should have listened, Margaret. There's no escaping this now." "Is that what you think?" Margaret replied, her voice trembling but fierce. "You've underestimated me." The tension in the air was suffocating. Margaret's instinct screamed at her to run, to get away before it was too late, But she couldn't. Not when she was so close to the truth. Not when she was standing face to face with the man who had destroyed her life. Suddenly, without warning, Gregor lunged forward, aiming the gun at Margaret's chest. But just before he could pull the trigger, a loud noise shattered the stillness, an unmistakable sound of a car screeching to a halt. Someone else was here. In the blink of an eye, everything changed. The screech of the car's tires still rang in Margaret's ears as she stood frozen in place. The barrel of Gregor's gun aimed squarely at her chest. For a split second, time seemed to slow down, the world around her narrowing to the sound of her own heartbeat and the distant muffled noise of the car's arrival. Her instincts screamed at her to move, to take cover, but her feet felt like they were glued to the ground. Then, the unexpected happened. A figure emerged from the vehicle, a tall man, dressed in a dark suit. He was running toward them, moving with the urgency of someone who had been following this trail for a long time. Margaret could barely process the situation, but she recognized the man instantly. It was Luke, the investigator. His face was a mask of determination, and his hand was firmly gripping a badge that hung around his neck. "Drop the gun, Ivanov!" Luke shouted as he neared the group, his voice firm and authoritative. "This is over." For a moment, no one moved. Gregor, his cold eyes locked on Luke, seemed to weigh the situation. David, on the other hand, took a step back, looking torn between his loyalties and the growing threat before him. Margaret didn't understand. She had never seen Luke act like this. She had never imagined that he would be so deeply involved in the web that had ensnared her. But there he was, standing between her and the danger that had stalked her for weeks. Gregor sneered, a twisted smirk spreading across his face. "You think you can stop me? I've been running this operation for years. You're too late." But Luke didn't flinch. "I've been tracking you, Gregor. You can't run from the law forever. We've got enough evidence to put you away for a long time." Margaret's mind was spinning. It felt like the walls were closing in. She had no idea that Luke, the investigator she had trusted, had been following her trail all along. He had known about David and Gregor, and now it all made sense. Luke had been the one to find the connections, to piece together the clues that led him to this moment. David stepped forward, his face twisted in frustration. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low and strained. "This was never about money. It was about survival. Gregor and we had no choice. You think I wanted to hurt you?" Margaret's head spun. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her as the pieces began to fall into place. David hadn't just been using her for her money. He had been trapped in a world of crime, of desperation. But that didn't excuse what he had done. Nothing could. "I loved you, David," Margaret said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sadness. "You took everything from me, and now you expect me to feel sorry for you?" David looked away, guilt flickering across his face. "I never wanted to hurt you, Margaret, but I was too deep in it. You don't understand." "I understand more than you think," Margaret snapped, her fury rising once more. "You used me. You lied to me. And now you're going to pay for it." Luke stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Gregor. "Put the gun down, Ivanov. It's over. There's nowhere to run." Gregor's face darkened, and for a moment Margaret thought he might actually shoot. But instead he lowered the gun, his lips curled into a bitter grin. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he growled. "This is just the beginning." Before anyone could react, Gregor turned and bolted toward the back of the house. Luke lunged after him, shouting for Margaret to stay back. But it was too late. Gregor was gone, disappearing into the woods behind the house. Margaret watched as Luke chased after him, her heart hammering in her chest. She wanted to follow, to confront Gregor, but her body felt like it was made of stone. She had already come so far, and now she was on the edge of the truth. She couldn't back down now. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Finally, Luke reappeared, his face grim. He had Gregor in handcuffs, but there was no sign of victory in his eyes. "We'll take him to the station," Luke said, his voice quiet. "But this isn't over." Margaret nodded, still reeling from the events of the past few minutes. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had come to this place seeking answers, and she had found them, but at a cost. Her life had been irrevocably changed. and now it seemed there was no going back. David stood there watching as Gregor was led away by Luke. His eyes were filled with guilt and regret, but there was no remorse for what he had done. He had ruined Margaret's life, and for what? Money? Power? Survival? None of it mattered anymore. "I'm sorry, Margaret," David said, his voice barely a whisper. "I never wanted this to happen." Margaret looked at him coldly, her heart hardening with each passing second. "Sorry won't bring back what you took from me," she said, her voice steady but laced with anger. "You don't get to be sorry now." David looked down, unable to meet her gaze. He had no excuses left. Margaret turned away, the weight of the situation crashing down on her once more. She had survived this ordeal, but at what cost? Her savings were gone, her trust had been shattered, and the man she had once loved was now a stranger to her. As she walked toward Luke's car, she felt a sense of finality settle over her. This chapter of her life was over, and while she wasn't sure what the future held, one thing was certain: she would never let anyone take advantage of her again. The sun was setting in a muted blaze of orange and pink as Margaret sat in the back of Luke's car, the gravel driveway of the isolated house slowly slipping away behind them. The events of the last few days, the shocking revelations, the confrontation with Gregor and David, and now this, her life was irrevocably changed. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something important had been lost along the way, something she would never regain. Luke's presence was reassuring, though. He was the calm in this storm. He hadn't just been her investigator, her guide through the labyrinth of deceit. He had been her protector, and now he was the one who could give her the answers she desperately sought. She wanted, no, needed closure. "How long have you known about Gregor and David?" Margaret asked, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Her voice was weary, but she had to know. She deserved to know. Luke kept his eyes on the road, his expression unreadable. "I suspected something was off from the beginning. I was following the money, tracking David's finances, looking for any patterns that could explain his sudden wealth. When I stumbled upon Gregor's name in the mix, I knew things were worse than I thought." Margaret nodded slowly, processing his words. "But you never told me. Why didn't you tell me everything? I trusted you." Luke's grip on the steering wheel tightened, but he didn't look at her. "I didn't want you to know. At first I was afraid it would put you in more danger, but as things progressed, as Gregor's network grew, I realized you were already too deep in it. I had to protect you, even if that meant lying to you at times." Margaret felt a pang of anger, but it wasn't directed at Luke. She was angry at the world, at the choices that had been made, at the people who had used her and betrayed her. But Luke had tried to shield her from the worst of it. She understood his reasons, even if they didn't make it hurt any less. "And David? What happens to him now?" she asked. "He'll be charged," Luke replied, his voice low. "But he won't be going to prison. Not for long, anyway. His connection to Gregor is enough to put him away for a few years, but he's too valuable to the syndicate. They'll come after him once he's out." Margaret frowned. "So? This is it?" "It's over." "Not yet," Luke answered. "There's still one more thing. Gregor's associates aren't going to take kindly to his arrest. We have to make sure that you're safe, Margaret. That means staying low for a while." She nodded, but a part of her wanted to argue. She wasn't afraid of them anymore. She had nothing left to lose. But she understood Luke's point. Her life was still at risk, and she had to be smart. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and arrangements. Margaret couldn't bring herself to return to her home. It felt like a place haunted by the ghosts of lies and betrayal. She stayed in a small, quiet apartment provided by Luke's department. It was far from luxurious, but it was safe, at least for now. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of sirens as the city's chaos carried on, indifferent to her grief. Margaret had spent most of her life living in a bubble, trusting too easily, loving too much. Now she couldn't look at people without wondering what they might want from her. What hidden motives lay beneath their polite smiles? She couldn't shake the feeling that she would always be a little too cautious, a little too guarded from now on. But something else had shifted within her too. There was a quiet strength growing in her, one that had been awakened by the hardships she had endured. Margaret had lost much, but she hadn't lost herself. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, she felt as though she was in control of it. Weeks later, the trial began. Gregor and David sat side by side in the courtroom, both wearing expressions of calculated indifference. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Margaret, seated at the back, watched them carefully, her heart hardening as the truth was laid bare before her. It was strange, watching the men who had once been so close to her, now reduced to criminals, their secrets exposed for the world to see. She hadn't spoken to David since the confrontation at the house. She didn't know if she ever would again. There were too many questions, too much pain. But she had no illusions. David was weak, manipulated by Gregor's influence, and there was nothing she could do to fix him. There was only one person who could be fixed now: herself. As the trial dragged on, with witnesses and evidence stacking up against them, Margaret's resolve grew stronger. She was ready to move forward, to rebuild her life from the ashes of the past. She had come so far, and she wasn't going to let it all be for nothing. The day of Gregor's sentencing arrived, and as the judge slammed his gavel, the courtroom erupted into applause.